The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our racial equity series, and it's entitled Trauma-Informed Racial Equity Practices. It is my privilege to introduce our presenter today, Maite. Maite, please take it away.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Check my watch for a second because I am coming to you all from Providence, Rhode Island, and I get my hours and time zones confused, but it is already afternoon for y'all, so it's nice to see you on screen. My name is Maite Antolo-Ovando. I am coming as a Racial Equity Partners Associate and Consultant, and I've had the privilege to work with ICF for a while now. And so today, what I'm here to do is just facilitate a conversation around trauma-informed services, trauma-informed practices, and how that relates to racial equity. So I'm going to move us right along, and then Erin is going to start us off with some polls in 1 second. But before we do that, here's the run of the day. So we're going to do, this is your welcome and introduction because I am your only trainer today. I'm going to discuss why we're here and what the goals are for our time together. I'm going to go through some guidelines so that we are the most engaged possible. I'm going to talk about contributing factors to homelessness and the trauma connection. We'll discuss a bit of a history of racism in connection to housing. And as I said at the top, trauma, what racial trauma is, and how all of this connects to trauma response and care, and to how we take care of our clients and also ourselves. And then, of course, we'll leave room for questions. So here are our guidelines for today. And this is something that as a Racial Equity Partners consultant, I highlight in every training that I do. So this is something that we discuss because the discussion or the topic at hand is a little bit heavy. And so we are, starting with guidelines to make sure that you all are okay as we go through this information. So one sort of guideline or expectation is some of this is going to feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. I will say at the very top that because that is the case, if there are moments where you feel like you need to walk away or take a break, please do so. If you're on camera and you want to get off camera, if you literally want to get up and get a drink of water, maybe walk around a bit wherever you are, please do these things because only you know how to make yourself comfortable or how to sort of withstand discomfort that might come up. So just as a reminder at the very top. We'd like you, as we discuss all of this as a group, to stay engaged. So I am going to be asking you all some questions and for participation, and you can do that by typing in the chat. You can unmute yourselves. I am the kind of person that likes to facilitate discussion and learning. It's not necessarily the Maite show, simply because I'm the only trainer. So in that vein, please speak your truth and speak from your experience. You don't speak for any particular group that you might identify with, but you do speak from your own experience, which of course is your truth. Please expect and accept non-closure. And so what we mean by that when we use these kinds of guidelines is there might be some things that we're going to discuss today, for example, racism, that is not something that we're going to resolve in a 2-hour training, unfortunately. But what we do in these kinds of discussions is plant seeds so that we grow from them, right? But we're not going to close everything up. And so that's just something to expect. Try to suspend judgment. So there might be some things that people say or something that you might watch and you think, I don't know how I feel about this, or maybe I disagree. I'm not saying that you can't disagree, but I would invite you to suspend judgment and to ask questions, which will come up again. So I ask you to ask questions and be curious about things rather than to judge. And then the last thing I'll say again as a reiteration is to take care of yourselves as we walk through this content. So let me keep going. And now I'm going to hand it over to Erin for 1 second. So as you see up on your screens, you should see question 1, which is who is in the room. So when we do these trainings, we always want to know who are we, sort of creating this learning environment with. So if you see that question up there, if you could answer it, that would be great. And then in a minute, we'll see what that information says. And then Erin, I'm assuming that you have this because I don't. Okay. All right. So it looks like the answers are in. So there are lots of others, was makes me want to know what that means. And if you wanted to type something about that in the chat, that would be great. And we have people that are shelter team members, rapid rehousing case managers, and supervisors. So thank you for that. And then let's see, let's go on to the next question. So here's the second question. So here, what we'd like to know is, what is your experience? Which I know seems broad, but really what we're trying to say is, are you someone with lived experience, maybe not only lived experience of homelessness, but lived experience of perhaps some sort of trauma or mental health situation, if you'd like to share that. Experience in the field of homelessness, whether you're a social worker, a licensed professional counselor, other type of counselor, other type of mental health practitioner, and then any other sort of experience. If you wanted to share that, you could type that in the chat as well. And I see that some of you have typed your answers in the chat. Thank you for that. I see care coordinators, social workers, housing navigators, program specialists, HMIS administratives or administration, special advocates, care coordinators, case managers, program analysts, client advocates. Thank you all. So much varied experience in the room. That's fantastic. Beautiful. So let's see. There are some people with lived experience. Thank you for sharing that. Experience in the field of homelessness, some social workers and other types of counselors, and then other, as you've shared in the chat. So thank you so much. Again, just helpful to sort of ground us in who's in the room as we walk through this information today. So let's keep going. So as promised, I'm going to review why we're even here, right? So what is the purpose of having a discussion that is centered around racial equity and sort of trauma-informed services? So here's the link there. Basically, as we know, racism is a traumatic experience that permeates our society and our work. And what we mean by that is clients, funders, and each other are coming in, working and living and sort of experiencing what it is to be in a system that is unfortunately based on a racist structure and based on white supremacy culture, right? So at the very beginning, I just want to acknowledge that the reason that we're having this conversation is that racism exists and it is a traumatic experience, right? And it permeates everything that we may or may not sort of do professionally. It permeates our personal lives. And then for some of us, that experience is even stronger. And we'll discuss that. And so the purpose of today is really sort of unpacking the nuances of trauma, of behavior connected to trauma, of how it impacts our clients, and how we might provide services in a way that reduces or perhaps helps heal traumatic experience through the relationships that we have with our own clients. And also, again, with the aim of reducing any sort of re-traumatization, which unfortunately may still occur. And we'll talk a little bit about that sort of at the very end of this discussion. And then also to talk about how we best sort of empower our clients and provide person-centered services to the people that we work with. And also understanding that these kinds of things are not only about the people that we serve or who we work with, it's also about working with each other. So again, just want to sort of center all of that for us at the very beginning. So here we go with your first opportunity to participate, because again, this is not just a Maite conversation. So what you see in your slide, or what you should be able to see, is common risk factors contributing to homelessness. And then on the left side of your screen, you see sort of definitions of trauma, which I will come back to. But what I'd like you to either type in the chat or unmute yourselves to hear you say, what would you say are common risk factors that contribute to homelessness? So when I ask that question, what comes to mind?
Substance use.
Yep, substance use. Thank you for unmuting yourselves. What else? Substance use.
Loss of income.
Loss of income. Yep. And I see in the chat mental health. Mental health issues, cost of living, history of trauma. Yep. Health crises. Family dynamics, loss of a partner, medical emergency expenses. Yes, medical emergencies. Ability to work. Yep. Domestic violence. Involvement in other systems such as foster care or incarceration. Yep. Couple more, and then I'll show you the magic will happen, and I'll show you what I've been thinking. And poverty.
Loss of job and included loss of income.
Yes, loss of job, loss of income. We might even add sort of sudden loss of job, because sometimes that just happens out of nowhere. Yep. And discrimination. Yes. So thank you all for that. So as you're going to see pop up on your screen now, these are, again, common risk factors. It doesn't mean that this is an exhaustive list, but you see many of the things that you all pointed out. So thank you for that, right? And so these are just sort of an example of situations that can lead to the experience of homelessness. And in a minute, I'm going to explain what these things sort of have in connection to what trauma is or how trauma might be defined. So if I move you forward, again, as promised, here's my definitions, right? So trauma can be divided into many different ways, but one of the ways that it can be defined is under these three different sort of sections. One is acute trauma. And so what we mean when we say acute trauma in the mental health world is it's a single event. So acute meaning it happened once and it's over. A good example of that is perhaps a car accident. It happens and it ends. Then there's chronic trauma, which is experienced over multiple traumatic events, often over a long period of time. So it's chronic, just like if we would think about chronic illnesses this way. So it's chronic because it goes on for a long period of time. And then there is something called complex trauma, which is a specific kind of chronic trauma that begins at a young age and continues over time and is typically caused by an adult that was meant to take care or protect a child. So typically when we're talking about complex trauma, we're talking about things that begin in early childhood or before, where the child was meant to be taken care of, and instead they're being exposed to some sort of physical abuse and or other types of abuse, which I'm going to discuss in 1 second. So again, just to sort of ground us in definitions, these are the three definitions of the types of trauma that can occur. And so the next piece that you're about to see is what are events that could be traumatic, right? And so you all just did a great job of giving examples of things that might lead to homelessness. So what I'm going to show you now is these are events that could potentially be traumatic. So if you see on your screen again, there are many different things, but some examples include things like, again, complex trauma would be something around or connected to child abuse or neglect or maltreatment, physical or emotional sexual abuse, again, accidents and natural disasters. Like I said, that's an example of acute trauma, war, community violence, medical intervention. Some of you mentioned medical emergencies in terms of risk factors for homelessness. That could be both financial and just physical and traumatic because of medical interventions themselves. Grief and loss can be a traumatic experience. And I will say something connected to grief and loss. It's not always that we're talking about the loss of a loved one or an unexpected loss. Sometimes loss can be around loss of identity, or for example, one of you mentioned the loss of a job or the sudden loss of a job as a risk factor for homelessness. That in and of itself could be something that could cause complex grief as well, and so could also be considered traumatic. Then you have, again, the idea of having maybe being raised by someone that's impaired as your caregiver. That again can lead to complex trauma. Separation from parents could be described as traumatic. Domestic violence, which one of you mentioned is a common risk factor for homelessness. And then there's cultural and intergenerational and historical trauma. So this is going to be a lot of what we discussed today, but I wanted you first to see again, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted you all to be able to see that traumatic experiences vary and they can occur again, one time or over time or over a long period of time, including at the beginning of one's life, right? But there are many different experiences that can be deemed traumatic. And we're going to define trauma in a bit as well. So don't fret if this feels like, oh, why is this all connected? And so another thing I wanted to point out again, as we're defining things, is this idea of stress or other things that could be sources of stress and perhaps some sort of traumatic experience. So adults and children can have other sources of stress. And what you see listed here, including the experience of homelessness, are, again, and you all have mentioned this, poverty, homelessness, discrimination, frequent moves, sort of instability, refugee or immigrant experiences. So when people are coming into the country under those kinds of experiences, school problems, bullying, and again, just to ground us in definitions, definitions of what is traumatic differ, right, between providers, between service providers in many different fields. But according to the National Center for Family Homelessness, homelessness itself, right, is traumatic for young children. The loss of community, possessions, routines, privacy, and security is highly stressful and can lead to anxiety, depression, withdrawal, and aggression at a rate 3 times higher than children who are not homeless. So children experiencing homelessness must deal with fears that their most basic needs won't be met. And so the other thing I want to mention here is while this definition is focusing on children, on the experience of children, another thing to recognize, which I'm sure you all already know, is that oftentimes when we're providing services to clients, we are providing services to clients that grew up in the quote system. So they are experiencing cycles of poverty and homelessness. And so the children that are defined in this paragraph are the now adults who potentially have children and so on, and the cycle goes on, right? And so I just want to point out the fact that even when we're talking about children, we're talking about the impacts over time of trauma and how that comes up in adult behavior as well. So how does this, again, connect to homelessness and to a history of racism? So I'm going to pause here for 1 second. And before I tell you what this is, does anybody know what these maps are? And if you do, could you either unmute yourselves or put it in the chat? What is this? What does this look like to y'all? I see some head nods if you'd like to unmute or type it in the chat. What is this?
Like a zoning for Boston?
Yes, zoning for Boston. Yep, thank you. And you know what? I didn't see who that was, but thank you. And I see that Willow wrote it in the chat too. It's redlining. Yep. So this is a practice called redlining, and this is basically an image that we use in other trainings when we're talking about the history of racism. And so again, just to make sure that we're on the same page, what happened was that the federal government under the Federal Housing Administration created a policy with mortgage underwriters and banks to create, again, quote, redlined maps of communities. And so what it, basically said was that green was the best and supported folks with low interest rates to get into the housing market. And when that was the case, it was supporting all white people. And then city zoning ordinances shored this up. And this is how white people built wealth over time, right? And then when you see sort of a D or a red line across certain sections, what that means is that the red lines were, again, not areas that were deemed sort of smart investments, let's say, and they weren't given a chance. And so red line areas were all Black and brown people, and it was virtually impossible to get a mortgage, insurance, or a loan. So it was basically impossible to create wealth for entire communities of people based on this housing policy. And then the other thing I want to say about that is, again, the connection here to racism is that that was a specific policy that was put in the books, let's say, to ensure that certain groups of individuals were given an advantage and other groups of individuals were at a disadvantage and were oppressed. And so these housing policies and other policies, and that is not necessarily the focus of today, so we're not going to go through that in depth, but I wanted to use this as an example to just highlight that these policies have a lasting negative impact on communities of color. So today, African Americans are disproportionately homeless at a rate of 3 to 1 compared to the general population. Native Americans are represented in this 8 to 1. And with Latinx communities, something sort of interesting happens, which is they are typically undercounted in homelessness estimates. And that tends to happen most often because of immigration status concerns. And so oftentimes families that are of Latinx origin or coming in as immigrants don't participate in certain counts because there is a fear of some sort of situation occurring having to do with their immigration status. So again, grounding us in how did this happen? How did we get here? So what you now see on your screen are definitions of racism, right? So there is structural racism, institutional racism, and interpersonal. So structural is, again, compounding effects of multiple factors. It's historically how laws and policies have come together to advantage white people, which I just mentioned with the example of redlining. And there are policies that have changed over time, but there are still some things that exist that are intentional policies that exclude other people by design, which might be less obvious, but they still do exist. Then there is institutional racism, which is the inequities in our organizations, places of employment, social services, government agencies, et cetera, where there's discriminatory treatment, unequal opportunities for folks trying to navigate everyday systems, and how we run our organizations and systems continues to advantage some over others. And I will also say here that sometimes this happens without the intention for it to occur, but it does. And then there is interpersonal racism, which is basically when one person targets another based on prejudice or negative bias and actively infringes on their rights. So again, as you'll see at the beginning of all of this, there's a lot of definitions of things, and there are going to be spaces for us to discuss, but I wanted to center us in what we're coming in with and sort of understanding, again, the sort of environment that we're working and living in. So what you're going to watch in a second is a definition of something called minority stress. And so again, if you have a thought around what this is or what this might be defined as, and you want to share that, please do so while I set this up for us. So let me just, and we're going to cue it here. And if I can get someone to give me a thumbs up if you can.
Minority stress is unique. It's additive to general stressors that are experienced by all people.
Thank you.
Stigmatized people are required an adaptation effort above that required of similar others who are not stigmatized. Minority stress is chronic. It's related to relatively stable underlying social and cultural structures. Minority stress is socially based. It stems from social processes, institutions, and structures beyond the individual, rather than individual events or conditions that characterize general stressors. Minority processes include distal stressors, which are those external, objective stressful events and conditions, which can be chronic or acute, and proximal stressors, which are individual internal stressors. These can include expectations of negative events and the vigilance that this expectation requires, the internalization of negative societal attitudes about a stigmatized identity, and identity concealment, which is the act of hiding one or more parts of an identity from some or all of an individual's social network. Characteristics of identity may be related to mental health both directly and in interaction with stressors. Since people's self-conceptions are closely linked to their psychological states, stressors that damage or threaten self-concepts are likely to predict emotional problems. On the other hand, minority identity may also lead to stronger affiliations with one's community, which may in turn aid in buffering the impact of stress. Salience, valence, and integration with other identities may be relevant to stress. Salience may exacerbate stress because the more an individual identifies with, is committed to, or has highly developed self-schemas in a particular life domain, the greater will be the emotional impact of stressors that occur in that domain. Valence refers to the evaluative features of identity and is tied to self-validation. Negative self-evaluation enhances stress. Integration with other identities is the goal in reaching self-acceptance. In optimal identity development, various aspects of the person's self are integrated. Many minority group members respond to prejudice with coping and resilience. Minority status is therefore associated not only with stress, but with important resources such as group solidarity and cohesiveness that protect minority members from the adverse mental health effects of minority stress. Two functions achieved through minority group affiliations are to allow stigmatized persons to experience social environments within which they are not stigmatized by others, and to provide support for negative evaluation of the stigmatized minority group. The minority stress theory model brings all of these elements together to highlight minority stress processes and to depict stress and coping and their impact on mental health outcomes. Minority stress is situated within general environmental circumstances, which may include advantages and disadvantages related to factors such as socioeconomic status.
Okay, I'm going to pause this there. And actually, I'm going to stop the share for 1 second, because I like to see people in the room when we're having these discussions. Thoughts, comments about what you just saw about minority stress, and or maybe another way that you would define minority stress. I'd love to hear it. I can
As
see.
a white
Yes.
as a white cis woman, I don't experience that, but I have a transgender child. And so seeing my son grow up in a fairly conservative area and finally move to San Luis Obispo and be invited and taken in by a queer community in his dormitory, I've seen such growth within my child and his ability to self-identify and feel a lot more comfortable in who he is as a person. So that makes me as a mom very proud.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that, Danielle. And you know what? I appreciate you highlighting that you as I think you said white, as a white cisgendered woman, that you don't experience this sort of minority stress, but that you have witnessed it because of your child. Yep. Thank you for that. Anyone else?
I just think, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Matthew, and then Rebecca.
I just think everyone deals with it. It's part of everyday life for all of us. Either it's happening to us or just someone we know. But it's real and it's happening everywhere. So aware
Yeah,
of it.
definitely. Thank you, Matthew, for making the statement around how common it is. And actually, in a minute, I'm going to talk about the numbers with trauma, which I think, and for some of you, I'm sure this is not new information, but just as a reminder around how prevalent and common not only stress and minority stress, but how common traumatic experiences are. Rebecca, thank you for that, Matt.
Hi. So just from a lived experience position, I know that growing up being mixed racial really was traumatizing in that it was hard to know which place you fit in or I fit in. It was extremely hard for my children. And oftentimes there was racism on both sides. So, and then growing up in a community where, you know, I appeared to be white or Caucasian, but identified with my other race was difficult as well, just to be accepted. And then there were parts of my family that were not happy with the fact that it seemed like I was privileged because I was light-skinned and blue-eyed. So that was really difficult.
Yes, yes. Thank you for sharing that, Rebecca. And again,
Sure.
I think that both you and Matt already have illustrated the complexity of this. So on the one hand, this idea that we all know what it's like, to experience stress, and again, to experience some sort of traumatic situation or something that feels that intense. So there's a commonality in that. And then at the same time, there's complexity around what identity is, right? And how that sort of leads to how we experience the world and also how others perceive us, right? So thank you all for illustrating that so beautifully. If you have more to say, please type it in the chat. And again, if we have more time, I will definitely come back for these, because these discussions are what make this shine truly. So let me go back to our slide so that we can say a little bit more about these statistics that I just mentioned. And also just to, again, ground us in these definitions, right? So what you see now, I hope, on your screen is, again, sort of another definition or further definition about what minority stress is, right? So the minority stress model, which is where this definition comes from, is a social research and public health model designed to help us better understand the lived experiences of people of oppressed communities. The model posits that within the social structure of a particular culture or society, certain oppressed groups experience greater incidence of, again, what we've just defined as minority stress based on race, sexuality, gender, disability, and others, right? In the form of prejudice and discrimination. And as a result of those experiences, members of oppressed communities experience greater negative health outcomes than majority group communities. And this leads to large health disparities, right? And again, the fact that this has been researched over time just, again, sort of provides evidence for the impact, the very real impact of these lived experiences. And so as we keep moving forward, again, to come back to trauma, let's define what that is, right? So what is trauma? There are many different ways to describe it, but there are some that sort of span across the different providers and fields. But basically, according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, trauma can be defined as the experience of a real or perceived threat to life or bodily integrity, or the life or bodily integrity of a loved one. And it causes an overwhelming sense of terror, horror, helplessness, and fear. Another way to think about this last and, the sort of overwhelm, it overwhelms our nervous systems and therefore impacts our behavior, which I'll say more about later. The National Council for Community Behavioral Healthcare states that trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed, again, by events or circumstances and responds with intense fear, horror, and helplessness. It's extreme stress overwhelming the person's capacity to cope. And again, when we talk about our capacity to cope, that is embedded in our system, in our nervous system. And so it's our systems becoming overwhelmed because of a lack of safety, because of us feeling like we are unsafe in a given situation. But you'll see in this definition that it's not just about our own bodily integrity and safety, it's also about the bodily integrity and safety of people that we love. So I'm going to pause there and see, is there any other thing that you would add to a definition of trauma? And you can just type that in the chat if you'd like. And or unmute yourselves. Like I said, you can do either one. And as you do that, I just saw Casey, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You wrote in the chat, as a Black woman in corporate environments, it is stressful at times when things I relate to my culture are interpreted as, quote, unprofessional, right? For example, hairstyles, ways of communicating, etc. Absolutely, Casey. Actually, maybe I can send this to you all as a resource after our training ends today, but there's a series of conversations that were interviews that happened in 2015 from the New York Times that were titled Conversations on Race with different groups of people. And in that conversation, there is discussion about, again, sort of these continued experiences that cause the minority stress that we were just discussing. So if I look again at my chat, Ian answered the question about what else could we say that trauma is. So trauma has long-term effect on how the human brain functions. Exactly. And we're going to talk about the brain in a minute. But yes, absolutely. So trauma can have a long-term effect on human brain functions and therefore behavior. Esther says, I appreciate the definition, including, quote, perceived threat in addition to real. Yes. Esther, do you want to say any more about that, either in the chat or unmute? I'm just curious if you're willing. If not, that's fine.
Thank you. I think that the addition of perceived threat is beneficial and appreciated by me and probably others because in the world, many times people can tell others, well, it wasn't real, or, you know, you just, I don't know, I feel like the perceived threat doesn't take away from a person's trauma or their own lived individual experience and what that looks like for individuals.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for that, Esther. And you know what? In probably in about 20 minutes or so, we're going to discuss again sort of traumatic experiences and their impact on behavior and why it is so important, as you've said, to have these definitions include perceived threat, because there is a reason for that. And we'll talk about that more.
I would like to mention something too.
Please go ahead.
It's kind of a double-edged sword, and that is, I'm a survivor of traumatic brain injury. So you have the trauma of the physical injury, and then you have all the psychological aspects of that. When I suffered that term didn't exist. It was simply called a concussion.
Yes.
Now, with the research that we have, I understand that I was textbook behaviors and everything I did, and we're going to see more of this type of injury in the homeless population simply because of the widespread return of our veterans, which I am also one. So just something for the background.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for adding that word. And let me see. Somebody has their hand up. Willow?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak on the fact, as someone who has complex PTSD, the fact that it isn't just the one or the several events that impacts you, but really that idea that trauma really permeates everything, the way that we act, the way that we think, the way that we develop relationships, everything in life. And it's very complex and nuanced.
Yes, absolutely. One of the first things that I learned as a practitioner, which I recognize I didn't say what my background was. I am a former director of clinical services in the homelessness world in Boston, Massachusetts, and I am a practicing bilingual school psychologist specializing in working with children in K-12 schools. and also, as you know, a consultant with Racial Equity Partners. And one of the things that I very first learned about trauma is, again, this idea that it's almost like the very first trainer that I was lucky to be around said, trauma-informed care is about putting on a trauma lens and understanding that when you're viewing the world from that point of view. So for the person that perhaps in a particular situation has been lucky in that they haven't experienced a particular kind of trauma that their client has, the ask is to put those glasses on. And then the other way of thinking about this, which you're pointing to, Willow, is, and for those of us that have experienced traumatic things, which again, I will actually give you the statistic in 1 second before we show the video, but for those of us where that is the case, that is the lens within which we operate in the world, right? Those are the glasses that we have on. And the other, if I take this metaphor a little bit further, there is hope in that there is a way to diminish that impact. There is a way perhaps to take the glasses off or to sort of use a different lens as we're moving through this process. So before I tell you that, and before we go any further, the video that you're about to see is about understanding now the connection between trauma and racial trauma. And actually, one of you already said in the chat, you mentioned intergenerational trauma and that some things are passed down when we don't even know it. And so we might be having a reaction to something and it feels, even as I say it to you, yeah, because I know some of you can see me, it feels out of place and very sudden. And so the benefit of understanding intergenerational situations and aspects of our behavior lies in a connection to perhaps trauma that has passed in sort of generation after generation. And then as I keep promising you the statistic, I don't have a slide for this, but I know just from my experience that on any given day, 1 in 5 American adults has had some sort of traumatic experience in their lives, right? And it could be an acute trauma, like I said, an accident, a natural disaster, all the way through complex traumas, as some of you have already identified, right? So the incidence of having experienced a traumatic situation is very high. And the other reality here is that we are all different human beings with all different experiences and sort of, I don't know, just things that we're coming to life with. And so while that incidence is very high, the way with which we or how we respond to those kinds of things can still be very different as well, right? It can be varied. So I'm going to show you all this video. Again, I do want to say that some of these images might be difficult, so please do what you need to take care of yourselves while you're watching this, and then we'll have a moment to debrief about it. So let me play it, and thumbs up again if you can hear it.
Racial trauma isn't just something that Black and Brown Americans experience regularly. It's something health experts say they're born into.
What makes it traumatic is how you experience it.
Similar to PTSD, racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress is the collective effect racism has on an individual's mental and physical health. It can be from major experiences like workplace discrimination or hate crimes, or it can be the result of an accumulation of many small indignities called microaggressions, or system or institutions that enforce structural oppression.
There was a national survey done by the American Psychological Association, and about 25% of all African Americans, 30% of all Native Americans report at least one of those experiences at least once a week.
The APA says not only do Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American people significantly suffer from racial trauma, but that it can also compound with additional oppression based on gender or sexual orientation.
It depends on the intensity and the frequency of how often you experience racism or how severe the event is, but you might start with just race-based stress. So something will be racist and you'll be exposed to it and you'll feel stress, but racial trauma is really when it has those long-term effects. It really sticks with you.
Immediate symptoms can include increased heart rate or blood pressure, heightened cortisol levels, sweating, or tension in the body. Long-term chronic exhaustion and fatigue are among the most common symptoms.
Just sadness, underlying or overt anger, even thinking differently about yourself. So sometimes believing or starting to endorse those stereotypes that people might have about your racial group. If you're experiencing racial trauma, you might have some of that internalized racism.
Increased hypervigilance, the having the nightmares or flashbacks, avoidance of situations where they may, perceive it as threatening. All of those are consistent with what we find in race-related stress and PTSD. So there are there's a lot of overlap.
Kind of, you know, bouncing back and forth between that and none, and never really feeling safe and socially connected and supported. And that also affects your brain and how your brain develops.
America's healthcare system impacts racial trauma too, making it more difficult not only to find help, but someone who understands a patient's experience. A 2015 study found that in the US, 86% of psychologists were white, 5% were Asian, 5% were Hispanic, 4% were Black. Meanwhile, some of the experts we spoke to are setting out to help. Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens released Black Lives Matter meditations for racial trauma victims and white allies.
Black Lives Matter.
Therapist Kelly Baker has helped organize Facebook Live videos with her local NAACP branch where anyone can connect to learn more about racial trauma. She's included sharing her own experiences.
I don't think you can say that there was ever a time for me when I did not, that I was never exposed to racism. You know, when I think about my family, you know, my mom, my grandmother, and the things that my mother experienced that were clearly racist, definitely affected how she parented her children.
What can be done to respond to racial trauma? Dr. Erlanger Turner tells Newsy adding an official diagnosis of racial trauma to the DSM-5, an encyclopedia of sorts for mental health professionals, is not the solution. He suggests racial trauma's existence is something everyone should be aware of, especially healthcare providers and policymakers.
If you are white, you do need to make sure that you try to understand that person's experience, that you provide some sense of solidarity, that you don't apologize. I think people oftentimes want to apologize in these situations, and that's really not helpful. We need solutions. And so I think that is one of those things that we have to do better and make sure that we take ownership.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
Okay. To stop sharing for 1 second to give a moment to process. Thoughts, comments about what you just saw, and or you could write it in the chat like I've said, or unmute yourselves. I'm gonna give you all a chance. Oh. Okay, I'm gonna take this as keep going, but if something comes up, please don't hesitate to share it in the chat. So what you see now, again, is, before I keep moving, is the impact of trauma. So we've talked about racial trauma and we talked about minority stress, which is all different kinds of minority groups, right? And so what you see on your slide before you now is the impact of trauma on diverse cultural groups, again, according to the Child Trauma Training Center of UMass. And this is just a list of potential communities, again, that have survived and lived through these kinds of situations and these traumatic experiences that we're talking about, or again, could be more prone to experiencing these things because of discrimination, right? And so again, might not be an exhaustive list, but just to use some sort of list to ground us in this, there's race and ethnicity, which we've discussed, immigrant and refugee status, language, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, disabilities, political affiliation, religious background, socioeconomic status, again, homelessness, right? And so this idea of the diverse groups that can be impacted by trauma and what groups they are connected to, right? And then if I bring it back to racial trauma, but let me just check my chat just in case. Martha wrote in the chat, thank you, Martha. This is the statistics on providers of color is not surprising. I very much wanted a provider that I could relate to during pregnancy, and it was not easy to find. And then Willow added, it helps me to contextualize more the experience of racial trauma with the understanding of what complex PTSD feels like. And yes, you're welcome. And again, one of the things that I really wanted to take an opportunity to do today with you all is to highlight one of the things that was said in the video, which is for all of us that do work really with any human being. Yes, we happen to be working in the area, most of us, of homelessness, but really to understand that racial trauma exists, A, and that B, we may or may not be people that are experiencing that or have generations of that happening in our families. And also C, recognizing that because it exists, there is a real impact, right? And that's what this is about today. So racial trauma then, again, connecting that, can involve a negative, sudden, and uncontrollable experience or crisis, or it can be an ongoing physical or psychological threat that produces feelings of fear, anxiety, depression, and helplessness. And so if you think about this, again, when we started first with the overall overarching definition of what trauma is, if I boil it down to one thing, something traumatic is something that makes me feel unsafe, makes me feel like I could be dead, basically, right? It's something that just overwhelms my body because I think that my bodily integrity is in danger. I feel like that is the danger that is around me, right? And so a way of defining it with racial trauma is ongoing physical or psychological threat. There is a threat, and as we said at the very beginning, there is a real threat and or a perceived threat against my bodily safety or the bodily safety of someone that I love. And so that is the same with racial trauma. Now, this is from Dr. Kenneth, make sure I say this right, Dr. Kenneth Hardy from the Healing the Hidden Wounds of Racial Trauma. What you see here is race-related trauma wounds can be internalized devaluation, which the minority stress video touched on a little bit. There can be an assaulted sense of self, an internalized voicelessness, so sort of internalized silence, and the wound of rage. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just examples of wounds that can occur because of racial trauma and racially traumatic experiences. And then again, discussing intergenerational and parental trauma. It's another way of thinking about this. This is trauma that can be passed down, as we've said, intergenerationally through a multitude of factors. So that includes epigenetic processes that increase vulnerability to various mental health disorders. Another way of thinking about this, and as a clinician, sometimes I talk about it in this way, that someone is predisposed to a particular disorder. And then when that predisposition is connected to the environmental factors, then it's more likely to occur. That's another way of thinking about that. Repeated patterns of abusive or neglectful behavior can happen. If you remember in the video, one of the doctors said she couldn't think of a time where in her life racism hadn't been sort of in her lived experience or in the lived experience of her mother, and that obviously impacted the way that her mother parented her, right? So it's very hard to extrapolate these things because they have an impact on behavior and on what we know to do in any given circumstance. Intergenerational and parental trauma can also include factors such as personality disorders or other disorders, substance abuse, family violence, and sexual abuse. And again, sort of a predisposition to certain things because of these ongoing traumatic experiences. And so because of the heaviness of all of this, and actually we're doing really great on time, before we go into an intermission, I want to stop the share and again, sort of just open it up for discussion. So far we've done a lot of talking about what is trauma, what is minority stress, and how is it different than other types of stress, and what is racial trauma and intergenerational trauma, right? And so I want to pause and just, again, give you all a moment to process and to make comments or ask questions about those things that we've just defined, because all of this is necessary to explore before we talk about what trauma responsive services are. Denval just wrote in the chat, I feel that one important thing that needs to be done is listening to the experiences of those who have these race-based traumas, validate their stories, tell them that it wasn't their fault, start the healing process, and equip them to battle their own trauma to overcome it. Yes. And again, thank you so much for saying that, Denval. The focus on validation and the focus on healing. Does anybody want to just walk me through what is it to validate someone's experience? What does that mean?
Be accepting of it, that you understand.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. So validation is accepting someone's truth for their truth. It might not always be that you understand it because you might not have experienced it and you're not them. So you can't fully, right, not in their body, understand it, but you can empathize with someone's experience. And in order to empathize, you have to first believe it to be true, right? And so to take what Denval was saying about listening to people's experiences of this trauma-based of these trauma experiences that we're discussing is to hear that as truth and to respect it. And as Martha just said, to respect it and validate it. Willow just typed in the chat, I believe that happened to you, right? I believe you. That makes total sense that you would be scared after that experience, right? And so the validation there is, I believe this to be your truth, and I understand the impact of it, or the potential impact of whatever this experience is that you're sharing, right? Yep. Anything else? Thank you all for your chat comments. It's really helpful. Anything else stick out with the videos that you saw? With the definitions we discussed so far? Yes, sorry.
I was gonna say, one of the doctors had said, he mentioned being able to put yourself in their shoes would be a huge tool for anyone to help someone out.
Yes, and Matthew, could you just to pick your brain a bit, when you're finding yourself in that situation, or when someone is doing that for you, how does someone put themselves in someone else's shoes? What does that look like?
You you validate what they're saying, and I believe you, and then just in your mind, for me, I just pretend I was them in that moment, and how scared would I would be, and what would I would be going through at that point in time.
Yes.
Yeah, and how scary it is, and just talk to them.
Totally. And you feel, I love what you just said about, and you feel it. So like, I'm them and I feel it. There's another researcher who is a qualitative researcher and writer, Brene Brown, for those of you that either know her or don't know her, but she's very big on vulnerability and on defining empathy. And so the way that she defines empathy, there's this beautiful video, which again, I can share with you all. And if we have time today, I can show it. But the video basically shows what it's like to be truly empathic towards someone else when they're sharing experiences of hardship. So if we're talking about racial trauma and someone sharing an experience of that racial trauma or the minority stress, the way that you sort of empathize is truly first by listening, as y'all have already highlighted, believing it, and being vulnerable enough as the receiver of this information. And this is the way the video depicts it, that hopefully I'll be able to show you, where you basically take someone else's cloud and put it over you so you can feel it. Again, it doesn't mean that you're having the same experience, because we're all different people, but we all know what it feels like to be sad, for example, right? And so it's being able to be vulnerable enough to feel that sadness and then communicate that to the person that you're supporting, working with, or working alongside, right? Because this, again, is not just about our work with clients. For me, this is very much about our work with each other and our clients. So yes, thank you so much, Matthew. Rebecca, let me see. Let's see what y'all are typing faster than I can read. Martha said, so Willow added, if that happened to me, I would feel scared too. Again, and that's called normalizing, right? And so it's perfectly typical, normal. I would feel the same way. Rebecca said, I'm surprised at how the information covered triggered some old feelings for me. Even though the trauma is not currently happening, the effects are still apparent. Yes. And Rebecca, again, and this is why that's actually in some ways a demonstration of empathy. When we see something that we can relate to, we might not be living it in the moment, but we can relate so strongly that we can still feel it. And in some ways, not to get on my box about this, but in some ways, the beauty of that is that literally our brains are designed to have mirror neurons that help us mirror each other to create that connection that can actually be healing, which is part of the trauma-informed response piece, which we will get to. So thank you for that, Rebecca. And then Martha said, the information further affirms some of my feelings I have had and fears for my child now, so it can be triggering as well. Yep. Thank you for that, Martha. We were actually in a different racial equity training this morning, and somebody brought up this idea that, they're raising a child and they're part of my minority group, and this idea of, oh my goodness, I'm going to have these conversations. And that is another example of minority stress, right? Like if someone is of a white background, typically not always, but they are not going to have the same kind of conversation, right? So it's a difficult thing to consider and think about. And I appreciate you all being willing to discuss this, even though it's hard and it can be uncomfortable. So I really appreciate your being able to share. Megan said, I appreciate that you shared the importance of treating our colleagues with the same sensitivity, respect, and empathy we offer our clients. I find that sometimes the focus is solely on our clients, but our staff deserve the same level of care, dignity, equity, and inclusion. Yes. See a lot of nods. And Willow agrees 100%. Yes, absolutely. Right. And I think one of the reasons why that piece of this is so important to me is that I think with saying something like that, the recognition there is that we're all human beings. Right. So we're all human beings. And some of us have different roles with each other, given our positions, given our work. And at the end of the day, the recognition that we're all human, I think actually builds on this notion of empathy, which supports how we work with our clients and how we're our best selves, not only with them, but also with each other. And again, we'll discuss this more when I get into the sort of pragmatics about how do you provide services in this way. But yes, I absolutely think it has to be both. I don't think that you can separate it out. And, that's my clinical and professional opinion. Thanks, everyone. All the kudos. Okay, well, since we're on such a high, I think that we should take our break right now. So it's 4:56, but I don't know if Aaron, is Chris still on? Does he want to say anything before?
Nope, he's not with us. So I think we can come back at 1 minute after, give everyone a 5-minute break. Is that okay?
5 minutes good. Are we okay with that? Yep, lots of nodding. Okay, great. 2 thumbs up. Thank you. All right, then we'll see you at 1 after. I don't know what time it is, but you all know. 1 after the hour.
That's why I said 1 after.
Thank you, Aaron. See y'all in 5. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here again and for coming back for this important discussion that we're having. So as promised, in a minute, we're going to talk about trauma-informed services and sort of some nitty-gritty, let's say, examples on how we might implement this with an equity lens. But again, I just find it really important to ground everything on language and on how we're using language. So that's what the first part of this has been. And so let me share my screen again. Let's see, share screen. Oh no, is it gonna do this? Oh, I'm sorry, just kidding. I don't know why that just happened. There we go. There it is. Okay. And so, as should not be surprising to y'all at this point, I would love to hear first what you would define as a trauma-informed response. What does that mean? What is a trauma-informed response? Trauma-informed services, trauma-informed care? What is all that? What does all that mean to y'all? If you had to define it, how would you define it? And you can, again, put it in the chat, unmute yourselves, and tell me what you think when you think trauma-informed responses, services, care. Austin, thank you for typing in the chat. Fear or lack of trust of a system or a person. Oh, interesting. Meeting someone where they are in their trauma and letting that shape your aid to them. I agree. Anyone else have anything different to type or share?
I think everything's a case by case. So meeting someone and then, like how Avery just said, figuring out what level they need, if they need to call up like mental health out to come help, or if it's just a sit down and a talking to.
Yes. So if you don't mind, I'm going to type that in the chat just so that we have a running list. So individualized care is what I'm hearing. And what you just said, Matthew. And then thank you. And let's see, after Avery and Matthew, Daniel wrote, being aware of the person's experience and providing services to support where they are. So becoming aware. So if we don't know, we have to become aware first. Yes, snaps for that. And then provide this individualized care that we've mentioned. Thank you, Matthew and others. Megan, you wrote, to me, a trauma-informed response is a response to a situation or challenge that takes into account that some people involved may have a trauma background and we need to be sensitive to that. Assuring safety, autonomy, and choice. Yes, yes. And April said, don't judge the person or the persons in the event. Be open-minded and ready to listen and assist. Yes. And so thank you all for all these great definitions. And I want to come back to something that, oh, wait. And then Heather just added compassionate, non-judgment. Yes. Compassionate, non-judgmental care. Excellent. And an excellent thing to strive towards, because I will tell you later why judgment is very human, but we'll get there. And then Austin, you said, I want to go back to what you said, fear or lack of trust of a system. So I actually think that that is a definition or a description of the system within which we live and work, unfortunately, and the reality that the mistrust is there. And then a trauma-informed response might be understanding that someone is coming into a situation without trusting a system that we are a part of. We, as whatever provider role I have, right? I am unfortunately still part of a system that doesn't feel trustworthy to someone. So I'm really glad that you brought up this concept of trust. And then let's see, Angela said, aware of one's trauma and knowing how to appropriately respond to not re-trigger them. Yes. So aware of other people's traumatic experiences or potential histories. I will add to what you said, Angela, that to also include, even though we don't have enough time for me to bring the justice to this, but just something for you all to consider on your own, to also understand our own triggers and our own traumatic experiences or how we might show up in the world and what that means in order to reduce this re-traumatizing of our clients or other people that we're around. So yes, awareness is definitely key. So thank you all for saying all the things that this slide is about to say. So a trauma-informed response is one that accounts for, which one of you said, that accounts for the fact that a traumatic experience may have occurred and impacted the client's view of the world and how they interact in it. This approach or response adopts a lens, which I mentioned before, that allows for behaviors to be understood rather than judged. Again, quoting one of you, that sort of suspending judgment. A trauma-informed provider doesn't say, what is wrong with you? They ask, what happened to you? And actually, one of you said earlier, and when you tell me what happened, I'm going to believe that what happened to you happened because you're telling it to me as your truth, right? And then the next question is, how can I help? And in so doing, the provider and client begin what we call sort of a healing working relationship. And another thing that I'm going to keep saying now from now until we stop talking today is that healing happens in relationship. And when I say relationship, I don't necessarily mean a personal relationship or anything like that. What I'm talking about is how we relate to each other. So in every interaction, there is a potential opportunity for healing to occur. I can't say this enough, so I'm going to say it again. In every interaction, there is a possibility for healing to occur. And that is where so if I am one part of an A-B conversation, the A that I'm bringing into this conversation has potential to create a healing environment for that person and for myself. Okay, so again, every interaction has a potential for healing. And then one example, let me see, I don't know that I can see this because of my notes. So one example of pausing, however, because I did say that to judge is to be human, one way of pausing our very human reactions to how people behave is by saying the following, which I borrowed from another trainer that focuses on trauma-informed care, is to stay curious and not furious, right? You might understand why you might be getting upset about something and maybe want to respond in fury, but the ask here, given the work that we're choosing to do, is to pause, notice our reaction and pause, and shift from feeling perhaps a negative feeling or being angry or something like that, and shifting that judgment to curiosity, right? Because to do that is to respond with a trauma-informed lens. Let me just make sure that I didn't miss anything in the chat while I was talking about the power of relationships. Oh, Avery just said she loved it. Thank you, Avery. So let me keep going. So again, I was talking about trauma-informed responses, right? If we talk about trauma-informed care, which is another, I'm sure, again, term that you all have heard or are familiar with in some way, trauma-informed care is an organizational structure and treatment framework or approach, it's another way of talking about it, that involves, again, understanding, recognizing, and responding to the effects of all types of trauma, which we talked a little bit about at the beginning of our session today. It emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both, and here's the key part here, for both participants and providers, and helps survivors rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. And that rebuilding of control and empowerment, again, is happening through the conduit of your relationship with the people that you work with and the people that you serve, or the people that you work sort of for, right, in support of. So again, it's emphasizing the sense of safety for participants and providers. So one of you said this at the beginning too, about this reality that trauma or traumatic experiences impact the brain. And so I'm not going to dive deep into this, but what I want to say basically is the following. When I mentioned that when a traumatic experience occurs, our nervous system and our brain becomes overwhelmed, what I mean by that is that this blue piece that you see up here, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is basically, for anybody that does yoga, when you put your fingers up here to your forehead, this top part of our brain is the prefrontal cortex, and it is the part of our brain that is responsible for thinking, planning, problem solving. Another way of thinking about it is it's our rational brain. When a traumatic experience occurs, or when something that I perceive to be threatening, here we come back to the perception piece of this. If something that I perceive to be threatening occurs, this blue part of the brain is turned off. And so my brain is no longer able to process information, to problem solve, to plan, etc. Right? And so when your brain is on stress, which as you see in the slide, high levels of the stress hormones increase this toxic firing and this feeling of emotional responses rather than rational responses. So again, what I'm trying to say here in the brain science of things is that our thinking brains are turned off when a stressful or traumatic experience occurs. Actually, I'm going to pause this for 1 second because I love hearing people's examples of these things. So I'm going to stop sharing and no pun intended, pick your brains again and ask this question. And actually, Rebecca, you kind of touched on this before when you were saying that you really felt something in your body as we were watching some things. So I want you to imagine what it feels like for those of you that drive, what it feels like when you're driving along and somebody cuts you off and you hit the brakes. I want you to really sort of breathe into this because we have time. So let's do this together, right? So breathe into what it feels like when you're driving and you're happily on your way, what have you, and someone cuts you off and you have to veer and hit the brakes. When you hit the brakes, how does that happen? Walk me through what is happening in order for you. Matthew, I just saw you make a thing. Go ahead.
Lickety split, super fast. Boom, just get it done.
Boom. Yep. Boom. And then Joanne just wrote, that happens every morning. I'm so sorry. And it's a reaction, right? Like the other thing that I saw sort of, Matthew, from you is the quickness of it. Yep. When you think about that, which is funny, even though I'm not driving in this moment, again, because we're talking about it, I can feel it in my body. What else is happening in your body? So you talked to me about the immediacy of the reaction. What else do you feel in your body when something stressful, like getting cut off while you're driving 75 miles an hour on the highway? What happens?
Fear, panic, stress, maybe even anger too. All of it just all balled up into one.
All that, right, exactly. Like you say all this and I'm picturing an explosion. But what I'm going to challenge y'all, oh, and there goes Denval. What I'm going to challenge though for a second is fear and panic are emotions. I want to know what it feels like in your body. And Denval, sorry, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, wrote tensing up. Yep. Heart races. Yep. The adrenaline, heart racing. Yep. Another way of thinking about this is, and this always happens to me when I'm doing these kinds of things or facilitating training conversations, my heart is racing and I don't always get this, but my hands sometimes get sweaty or cold. And then once I'm in it, now I'm in it. So that all of those things have gone away because I'm now in this with y'all. And I feel like we're connecting and so I'm okay. But the beginning of it feels like, is it going to be all right? Are they going to understand what I'm saying? Are they going to answer my questions? And what if no one says anything? Right? There's the Maite spiral. There's a view into my anxiety spiral around this potential, right? Because it's a potentially stressful situation that I'm living through. And then I've gone past it, right? But really my point in all of this is, remember how we were talking before about awareness? This awareness, this sort of awareness of what happens in your body when a stressful situation occurs is another way of becoming aware of what triggers you. And if I connect that to traumatic experiences, again, if there is a way in which you can work with clients in order to discover with them, what are the things that impact them that can potentially, again, make their brain shut off and make them go from being a thinking person to a person that is reacting, then you are already 10 steps ahead of the game. because you're helping them become aware of what could potentially trigger a behavior or a reaction, right? Versus, and or allowing them to have that heightened reaction and get through it, much like I was explaining for myself, right? Because if y'all had asked me something in the very beginning, I might not have been able to do it because I'm managing all these things at once. Now I'm fine. So you can ask me a million things if you want, and we can keep going, right? So it's all of this understanding in your body. That's where the awareness begins. What is your body telling you when you're having a stress response, right? Angela just added, you may cry from the fear. And Chris also gets the Maite spiral. Oh my gosh, we have to like copyright that now. But yeah, so again, just giving you sort of real, not to say that other examples aren't real, but perhaps easier examples to dive into around what your body is doing and how it's responding when stress is occurring. And then add that and sort of now imagine what that feels like for someone that has had a traumatic experience and how they're reacting from that space. Another visual that I want to give you before I go back to the slides is, I don't know if y'all are familiar with this. Oh, thank you, Imelda. Shallow breathing, another good example. Difficulty breathing can also happen. Again, I don't know if y'all are going to know what I mean, but either the game of Taboo, where they have that thing that the beeper thingy when you're playing Taboo and you're trying to guess words. That's one example. Or there used to be a button that was the easy button from Staples or something, and you press it and it says, that was easy, or something like that. Okay, so you all have some sort of button in your brains, hopefully. The way that I also explain trauma or traumatic experiences and triggers for people is imagine that because of the type of traumatic experience you have had, and if I bring it again back to racial trauma, to someone that has had minority stress chronically their entire lives, because for those of us that have a darker skin tone than white, we can't take our skin tone off, correct? So that potential for racial trauma is forever because my skin tone isn't going to change. And so if I use this example of a button, that button, it's like the Taboo button or the easy sort of button that's beeping, that's going like that, like beep, which I won't do longer, but to drive my point home. This beeping is just constant. It is a constant thing. And then on top of that, add everyday situations like, can you please fill out this housing application? Why didn't you come to case management meeting X at 9:30 in the morning? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like I see a lot of nodding. Thank you, Ian. So again, and then understanding that from that point of agitation or constant management of my body being overwhelmed, of course I'm going to have a reaction to you saying, Maite, why were you 5 minutes late? I'm going to be like, are you kidding? Let's have this conversation about why you care about how long you've been waiting for me. 5 minutes, I'm so sorry. Again, just an example. So what I'm going to come back to show you now in the slides is something called the window of containment. Thumbs up if y'all can see this again. Thank you, Matthew and Ian. So what you see now is called the window of containment, and it's introducing again this sort of idea of how does trauma, now that we know what that is, or how we might define it, how does that literally impact how we show up in the world and how we might behave? So this window of containment shows you the sort of blue line says contained, calm, alert, feels present, feels safe. So this idea is that when we are in a state of calm, which I'm not quite there because I'm presenting, right? So I'm still sort of on performing. So I have a little bit of stress, but I can manage it. If I was resting, which is what I will do after this training, I will be contained, sort of my emotions will be within my body and I will be more calm, still alert, and very present and feel safe in my body, which I feel safe now. But again, I'm a little activated because I'm presenting. Then you see when there's a little bit of increased stress on either side, you might be a little bit more active, a little bit agitated. Perhaps if somebody were to call me out of the blue right now, I'd be like, really? Nope, not right now. And why are you calling me right now? And I might get a little bit more annoyed than I would if I wasn't in the middle of a training, right? And then the extreme examples of this, when there is an extreme stress. So if someone is triggered, so again, if we go back to this experience of feeling unsafe, and if it's at the level of trauma, then I am so triggered that when something else comes into my purview, if I have another experience, I'm going to react from a triggered space. And what that means is that I'm going to be either panicky, I'm going to run away, which I'm going to talk about in a second. I'm going to react instead of actually think about my response and then respond, right? So when someone is activated and outside of this window of containment, they are not responding to you, they are reacting, if that makes sense. So I'm going to keep going. And I'm going to give you an example of, again, what this might look like when we're talking about racism and the impact of racism itself. So I'm going to show you this video first, and then we'll talk a bit more.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Oh. Mosquito bites and our itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland.
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
John, shopping is so bad. Share too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
Pretty,
Can I touch it? Can I please?
is annoying. That makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black one.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
It looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggression.
Okay. So I give this example to you all again as an example of the connection between things that cause stress in our lives, right? So stress making situations that then impact our behavior. So microaggressions over time are what increase and exacerbate the minority stress, like we mentioned before, right? And it is connected to racism, right? This is happening because of racist policies and racist ways of thinking. And so the other thing I wanted to point out here, which we mentioned at the very top, was, again, that is what connects this to racial trauma and to stress, but it can also lead to these sort of responses, right? Feeling disempowered, feeling a loss of control, fear, and focusing on your survival because you really believe and know that your experience can be threatened, right? That your lived experience can be threatened. And so I bring this up because, again, to understand that when someone is reacting to something, they might be reacting from a space of this extreme stress and triggered space because of all of the things that have happened to them before they've walked into an office to talk to you, if that makes sense, right? That's the example to think about there. So I mentioned before, right, in the window of containment, that when someone is sort of at the extreme part of that window, so not contained and triggered, there are going to be these responses that occur. And some of you have mentioned, again, understanding and having lived experience of complex trauma. And so what this is a picture of is just possible responses to triggering situations. And what ends up happening, which is just an evolutionary response, is fight, freeze, or flight, right? Those are the typical. People talk about flight, fight, freezing. There's also something called fawning or social engagement and what that looks like. Basically, what I want to say in this illustration is just to understand the kinds of behaviors that you might see that are connected to these immediate reactions. So using flight as an example, someone might literally run away from having a meeting. Someone might shut down. And so freezing looks often like someone disassociating, which in psychological terms really just means if you're talking to someone and you're no longer receiving any input from them. So if we were having a conversation and Matthew wasn't nodding, for example, or giving me information that is telling me that he hears what I'm saying, I might wonder if he was there. And I might literally be like, hey, right? And so that in doing something like that, what I'm trying to gauge is, are you here with me? And if you are not, then that might be a response to something that's triggered you. And I want to pay attention to that. And actually, if I go on with this example, I might not know everything. Let's pretend that Matthew is our client for 1 second. And I might not know everything about his history yet, but I've noticed that when I asked about, I don't know, for example, something related to family, I've completely lost the connection that I had with him when we walked in. And I need to note that. It doesn't mean that that day I'm going to dive into it. And PS, it doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that you all know everything there is to know about your clients' lives, because that is not the case. What I'm suggesting is that you notice so that you can pause and then again, provide trauma-informed response to what you notice. So that is basically what I'm going through in terms of these images, is again, just explaining what might happen, what the behavior might look like because someone is responding from a triggered space. So let's keep going with the impact of trauma and behavior. So I'm going to show you one more video and then we're going to pause to discuss a bit. Am I? There you go.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threats. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behavior. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, But it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behavior that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
Pause us there and see. So before I go through that slide, let me pause. And you'll notice that in that video, one of the things that was highlighted was the importance of relationship. Again, right here I go with a broken record around relationship. And the neuroscience behind this, which is really fascinating, is that it's not only children's brains that can adapt and can change over time given different input, it's also adult brains, which I do think is maybe not new, but fairly new scientific information around the flexibility and adaptability of our brains. The quickest sort of thing that I can point to is how people have managed and how we keep managing the pandemic and COVID-19 and its impact, right? And so I appreciate all the nods and responses to this, but yes. And so again, what that tells us is we are incredibly adaptable creatures, right? We are, as humans, can adapt to many different things. And that also means that literally when new experiences occur, different neurons in our brain are firing and creating new pathways that create new behaviors for us within the context of a relationship, which is why I said before, it's in the interaction, in any interaction that you all are having with clients and with each other, there is a potential for healing to occur. And again, even though in that video, the sort of point was childhood trauma, what I said to you all before is the child that experienced trauma then becomes the adult that we're working with, right? And then it's our sort of opportunity to then work with them and show them through experience, as you also saw in that video, through experience that while there might be the situations that still are rightfully perceived and are threatening, there are situations that we might be perceiving as threatening that are not. And we as service providers have that opportunity to then say, I know that the system is difficult and maybe challenging and unfair, but I am here to support you. And in so doing, I am creating literally new neural pathways for you in that experience. Does that make sense? As I say all of this? Okay. Any thoughts, comments about the video before I keep us moving? If not, I'm happy to do so. I'm going to keep going in case we have more time at the end. So as you heard me say before, one of the things that I recommend or suggest that you do when you're thinking about providing trauma-informed responsive services is to be curious instead of furious when you notice a behavior, because all behavior is a message. All behavior that you see, and when I say behavior is what you observe, so what you are seeing another person do or say. What you're observing is giving you some sort of a message. And sometimes nonverbal behavior is even that much more powerful, right? So again, back to this example, I used to say this when I was a director of clinical services and was training my staff to do intakes with new clients. When someone is having a conversation with you and then they literally move their body away from you, that is a message. That is a message that you're going too far, or I can't manage this conversation anymore, or what you've asked me is too difficult for me to answer in this moment. And so my trauma-informed response in that situation is, you know what? We don't have to answer all of these questions today, or maybe we can do it after a break. Do you want to go take a break? Let's go on a walk, right? Just to give you a quick sort of example. So again, the ask here is to be curious instead of furious when you see a behavior that you're a little taken aback by. You want to ask yourself, the behavior that you see, is that behavior because of fear? Is it about fear or is it about safety? And to think about the fact that as providers, in whatever role we might have, our sort of aim or goal is to provide safety, is to increase our client's sense of safety so that they are able to actually engage in something with us. Because the other thing that I don't think I've said yet is when we are agitated, so when we are outside of our window of containment, it is very difficult to engage with the world. It is very difficult to have a conversation with someone when they're escalated, which again, I'm sure that you all have ample experience with, right? So you want to ask the question about fear or safety so that you understand how to respond. Is this about overwhelming emotions and difficulty thinking? Are they not able to express themselves? Is there a need for control or connection here? Another quick example for this is, let's say there's a consequence to be had or a choice to be made. Psychology and research tells me that typically when you're asking adults for choices, just like with children, honestly, more than 3 choices is too many. 2 is probably optimal, right? So when you can, if you can provide choice for someone, what you're doing there is giving them back control. Because the other thing that trauma does is actually, I have another colleague that says trauma is a thief, because what trauma is doing is it's taking something away of you, right? Might be taking a piece of you, might be taking the sense of safety off of you. It's taking something away from you, like control. And so a response to that is, how do I instill control or choice making in a situation when I'm working with a client or again, with a colleague? You can ask, is this about shame? And again, ask questions about this or just be curious about it over time. And remember, as I've said already, the positive interactions and relationships create the healing, right? Healing happens in relationship. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And also remember that it's not about you as in us as providers or people that are working with clients. It's about the client and their sense of safety. I will also say, as a side note, in this idea of it's not about you, I inherited that from a colleague who was talking about de-escalation and how to provide safety and a sense of safety for clients. And this reminder that when you're having a reaction to someone's behavior, again, we're human, so we're gonna react, we're gonna have a feeling. But the ask is, because of what we're doing and because of our willingness to learn and be in these trainings and these discussions, because of that willingness, we are also equipped and able to practice pausing. So you can have the reaction, and the ask is, can I pause through this perhaps disrespectful interaction I just had, or when someone is getting a little too close for my feeling of safety, like when something is happening, can I pause and then ask a question like, I wonder why this is happening, rather than making a judgment. Okay, so let's now shift, not totally shift, because equity is about providing something that's individualized, as one of you said earlier today. But let me just center us in, how do we do this with trauma-informed services, right? So how do you deliver trauma-informed equitable services? So first, what I'm showing you here is this image, which again, some of you might have seen already, that is depicting equality, equity, justice, and liberation. And what you see here initially is 3 children, I believe, that are wanting to see a band perform, right? And so my question to you all is, and maybe you can type this in the chat, is what do we think about this image? What is equality, equity, justice, and liberation? How does this sit with you all? Does this feel like it's defining things as you know them to be? Have you seen something like this before? Some nods, yep. Any thoughts, comments, questions about it before I keep going? Just want to give you the option. Okay. If not, one thing I will point out as you're looking at this image is, I know that when I was very first introduced to an image like this, the only images that I could see were the equality and equity pieces of the puzzle. Thank you, Danielle. I just saw that you said you love it. I'm glad you do. And thank you, April. I'm glad I'm looking at the chat, because y'all just said, April just said, I like liberation. No one had to be elevated to be equal. Yes, snaps for that. And so thank you for creating the space for me to say what I was about to say next, which is that the beauty of this image from my perspective is that it goes from recognizing that equality is not the same as equity, that equity is becoming aware, again, using y'all's words, not mine, becoming aware of people's needs and understanding that people have different needs, and then therefore responding in that way, right? So that's why in equity, everyone has access and can see what's going on in the band because they were given what they needed in order to see, right? Justice is about removing the barrier, literally, right? And then liberation, at least from my perspective, and perhaps because I am also a singer, from my perspective, the liberation piece is I get to not only witness what's happening, I get to be part of it. So if I want to get on that stage, you better believe that I can do it because I've now been liberated because that barrier has been removed, right? And so liberation just takes this a bit further. And so again, defining equity, even though we kind of just did, just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So equity considers the following. It considers the disparities and barriers on individual, systematic, and structural levels, right? It accommodates people's needs, which we've highlighted before, based on their intersection of experiences and identities within our society. And I think the other thing that this is saying is that we recognize that we are more than one identity, right? And I say we because I believe this for all of us. We are all sitting at intersections of different experiences. And so equity accommodates people's needs based on that. It focuses on providing the right of access to opportunities. First and foremost, it's about transforming the systems, which was a system that we spoke about at the very beginning of our discussion today. And equity uses targeted strategies based on data, so based on data that you are collecting. And then equity lifts all of society by leveling the playing field, or as you saw in that image that we were just looking at, it levels the playing field and then can go further and liberates because of justice, right? Through justice, liberation occurs. And so before I go into this, actually, I'm going to stop my share for 1 second. I want to sort of preview for you the couple of videos that we're going to see before we end today, and then we leave room for discussion. So the 2 videos that I'm about to show you all have to do with, again, if I'm internalizing the reality that racial trauma exists and that it's an experience that I can validate and that I can empathize with for my client, such that that creates a healing relationship with the person that I'm working with. So from that premise, then comes, if I understand this to be true and become aware of it, how do I then respond? What is my behavior now, right? Because I don't know about you all, but I often go to discussions, trainings, what have you, and walk away thinking, but what can I do? Like, what is something that I can walk out tomorrow and do? So these next few slides and videos that are going to show you what that looks like. So that's kind of the premise of it. So I'm going to show you one thing that could potentially have what I've called a small impact, but I know that for many people, it's actually a really big impact. So I'm going to come back and share my screen so that you all can see what I'm talking about. And let's see, here we go. Oh, no.
Your name is your identity. It's something you're supposed to take pride in and feel ownership of. But when teachers, coworkers, and friends constantly screw it up and don't even try to get it right, that can really change how someone feels about their place in the world. So we decided to talk to a few people that have firsthand experience with this.
My name is Rekha Shankar, not Rika, not Rekha, and definitely not Rachel.
My name is Wanjiko. So that's like a number 1 and a letter G and co like company in one word. So Wanjiko.
My name is Momo Pujay, not Momor Paye, not Mumo Pujay, not Mamu. It's Momo Pujay. It's so simple.
My name is Mamadou, not Armadillo, not Marmaduke, not Mumu, not Mumam, Mamadou.
If you want to say my name correctly, it's Maritza Montañez, but you can just say Maritza Montañez. And that's the anglicized, easy version that you should be able to say.
People mispronounce my name 7 days a week.
In 6th grade, my English teacher mispronounced my name for an entire year.
An open mic is just like Matt, Jim, Matt, then Muma. I'm like, get the fuck out of here.
So I have to introduce myself with a little mnemonic, like I'm Rekha, like rake, as in the thing for leave. And I still get my name mispronounced, even with the mnemonic.
When somebody actually gives me that question, like, hey, am I saying this correctly? Immediately, I want to marry them.
I just be like, oh, they said Maritza. That's so exciting.
That's how low the bar is. That's how many people have mispronounced my name and didn't care about it.
So there's a bunch of different types of mispronouncers.
There's the gracious mispronouncer, somebody who's trying their best and is going to keep trying.
And if everyone did that, oh, it'd be great. We'd all be in such a better place. There's the mumblers that kind of start and then trail off into the distance. Marvin? Maritza?
Like the Doppler effect.
They're begging for you to like, hey, please work something out.
Then there's the nicknamers. There are 2 types of people who are nicknamers. The people that give you a shortened version of your name, like, hey, mama, that's not my name. And the people that'll give you an English version of your name, like, hey, Martin, is like, I didn't have a dream.
I had a tennis teacher once that was like, Reka, I'm just gonna call you Rachel. Thanks, other parent.
You don't get to assign me a nickname. That's not how it works.
I like the nicknamer who doesn't even say your name, just says fill-ins for your name, like my guy, yo, what up, dog? My G, my dude.
No one should be a nicknamer. They're terrible people.
Then there's the whatever people. These people don't care about your name at all.
You will correct them. They will say whatever they have been saying, and then just say whatever.
We're definitely not gonna be friends. I already don't like you, so this is not good.
If you do this, you are a bad person. When you get your name mispronounced all the time, it makes you feel like less of an individual because you have to respond to all these things that are not your name. Dealing with this almost every day is mostly just exhausting.
If you don't say my name correctly, it's basically like saying I don't care about you as a person.
Imagine if your name was Rachel and you had to start responding to Rachel or Rackle. That's not your name. It's nobody's name, and it sounds gross. When someone says my name right, it feels just like, oh, we're baseline agreeing that I'm a person.
When you're younger, it's really easy to feel discouraged by your name, but as you get older, everybody loves hearing your name. And then they want to say your name. You want to hear your name being said by people, and you take pride in it. It's like things go from being a negative to being a positive for you.
So say my name right, or my mom's coming for you.
Okay, let's see. So let me just stop for 1 second. So why do you all think, oh, let's see, let me look at the chat before I ask a question. And thank you, Ian. You said that you liked the equity image and you used to explain it to equity when I get the chance. Excellent. And then I see Janetta. Hopefully I'm saying your name correctly. This definitely resonates with me. No one spells my name correctly. Yes. Oh, I'm good. Thank you, Janetta. And yes, as a person who, my name is Maite, I go by Maite or Maite. My legal name is Maria Teresa or Maria Teresa. And so I very much connect to Maritza in the video because I tried to come up with a name that seemed okay, but I probably correct people once a day at least. And that's okay. And it's part of my identity, right? So my question to you now is, and Janetta, if you wanted to say more about why it resonates or you please elaborate, please do. But my question sort of overall for the group is, how does this connect to something that is a small impact that is trauma informed and equitable in your work? How might you use this? Why am I showing you this video? There's part of me that wants to pick on Ian just because you were smiling a lot and nodding as you were watching. But of course,
every interaction can create a healing moment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for taking that. Yes. Right. So even in the interaction around someone's name, which again, if we really think about this, right, our names are central, and maybe we don't all feel this way, but for many people, our names are central to our identity. And so if I'm in a situation where someone doesn't take the time to learn how to say my name correctly, or even ask how I want to be called or what I want to be called, right? Then you're already from the get-go showing me, as the gentleman said in the video, that you don't really care about me. But if you do the flip side of it and make sure and or say, Maite, I know I'm going to mispronounce your name and let me say it again, or can you help me do it? And then once I do it a couple times, and they should have it by then, right? Then that's great. And then that shows me that you care about how you interact with me just from the get-go, right? Yep. Yes, thank you, Ariel. It helps our clients feel validated. Jillian said, my assistant director misspells my name and confuses me with another girl in our office. Our name is part of our identity, our culture. Yes, again, your name is part of your identity. It's part of your culture. It's connected to your family, perhaps. Again, not everybody has the same experience, but our names are central to who we are often. And so it's important to be recognized in the way that we would like to be recognized. Yvette said, to get my name mispronounced, it's easy. Yvette, Edith. Oh, Yvette, Yvette. Yep. I'm even known as Stephen by some people. Oh my goodness. All the different, right? All the different iterations of names that can happen. But again, my point in including something like this in today's discussion is to show you that tomorrow you could walk into your spaces where you're speaking to clients or each other, right? Because I've spoken about this the whole time. This is not only about how you interact with clients, it's about how you interact with each other, with colleagues, with people that you meet, right? So you could tomorrow or later today use something like this and recognize that what we all want is to be validated, right? What we all want is to be heard and seen. And one of the first ways that you can do that is by recognizing that someone wants to be named whatever it is, or called by their actual name. My name is pronounced Samuel. This is Samuel speaking in the chat. My name is pronounced Samuel, but I'm always Samuel, which is my dad. And you can't autocorrect a name. I tend to go by Sam otherwise. People don't pronounce right and I get exhausted. Yes, repeating the proper way. And then Shannon said, my name is super easy, but I have been called Sharon my entire life. See, again, these things that we don't even know, and then they happen and impact us all in some way.
Yeah.
So thank you for saying that. Oh, yes. Do you want to say more, Rebecca?
I just wanted to say I had the opportunity to just do this recently with one of the ladies that I work with, and we were completing some paperwork, and she has a very unique last name. And because I grew up with a maiden name that nobody was able to pronounce, or I don't believe I've ever heard anybody apologize for chopping up my name. It was just like, okay, whatever it is. So so when I wasn't sure about how to pronounce her name, I said, I really want to know how to pronounce your last name because I'm not sure. And like her whole body lit up. She was like, oh, wow, like I could totally see the difference. Like she leaned forward, and so the body language changed. So yeah, that just hit home for me because I just had the opportunity to do that.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
And again, we could talk about this for on and on and on, and I would love to, and maybe in another opportunity we will. But I am going to move us along so that we do have time for questions at that very end. So as promised, first we started with something that from my perspective is something that you could walk out later today and do it, right? Today, tomorrow. Now let's talk a little bit about what does this look like? And this is trauma-informed care in general, but then from my perspective, all of these trauma-informed tenets are equitable in nature. So what does this look like on an organizational level? And what you're going to see in the next two slides are basically examples side to side of how traditional services might be delivered, or in a traditional way, let's say, and what the trauma-informed version of that service delivery would look like. So let's use the second one as an example for this slide, and then I'll do more in the next one. So you see relationships are based on hierarchy and positional authority in a perhaps more traditional way of providing services, and the power sharing is limited. In a trauma-informed space, in which what you're trying to do is create opportunities for, as I said before, for people to regain control because control has been taken away because of traumatic experiences. In order to do that, what you can do is share power, right? So in a trauma-informed organization or service delivery model, power is shared. Collaborative relationships are based on authenticity, honesty, and recognition of power imbalances. Again, what I would add to this, again, from an equity perspective, is a recognition that power imbalances and inequities exist. And so therefore, our work is about reducing those inequities and creating a situation where power is shared and where you are actually working in partnership with people in shared power rather than having power over another person. Again, another example just to highlight this idea. Primary goals are defined by service providers as perhaps a traditional way of looking at things. In a trauma-informed space, primary goals are defined by the client, right? Because they are the experts on their lives. They are the experts on what traumas they have lived through and are working through. And we are simply there to walk alongside them and to support them in their healing. But these goals are not about our lives. This is about their life. Coming back to this idea of it's not about me, right? It's not about me, it's about them. And again, another example, instead of seeing clients as broken, vulnerable, and needing protection from themselves, which I think one of the videos highlighted, or maybe I'm getting my trainings confused, but there's this idea that we have all the answers and that we know better. In a trauma-informed space, what we have to understand is that we need to provide choice. And one of you said this early on today, provide choice, autonomy, and control, because that is central to healing from this idea or from this experience. The trauma has stolen my peace, basically, right? It's stolen my control, my sense of safety. And so if I'm in a situation where actually my autonomy and my choice making abilities are respected, then slowly that is going to build into a healing relationship, into a healing process. And again, all equitable in nature because of how trauma-informed care responses and approaches are. So what I will leave you with today is, as you might remember this from the very beginning of our discussions and sort of our agenda for the day, this has been both focused on client behavior and our own awareness of ourselves, right? And one of the things that I wanted to mention in connection to this topic today was the concept of compassion fatigue, which might be a review for some of you because I know we've done other trainings around this. But I think it's important to highlight that when we're working with people that have experienced trauma, that are in distress actively, it does bring up things that we have experienced ourselves, and providing space for others can be taxing, right? And so compassion fatigue simply talks about that. It's when individuals may experience compassion fatigue, they're exposed to other suffering in a consistent basis. And so we have to be able to recognize that as potentially secondary traumatic stress for other people, or vicarious trauma is another term for it. And so the reason that I bring this in is because I want you all to have resources. Again, these are sort of a review and a list of resources, but I want to make sure that you all hear me say that in order to provide trauma-informed and equitable services, you have to be aware of yourselves as well, right? You have to be able to take care of yourselves. And part of that, to take something that you all said to me before, part of that requires awareness of self. Everything starts with awareness of self. And so if you're aware of yourselves, then you know how you're showing up to your client services, meetings, to situations with your colleagues, whatever it is. As long as you're able to do that first, then you've already gone a long way. So I will stop speaking at this moment and either ask if you all have questions, other comments that you'd like to say that you haven't had a chance to say. And I just want to thank you so much for your engagement and for sharing the experiences the way that you have, for the chat. It's all been fantastic. So I really appreciate that. But thoughts, questions? And Ian, I just saw that you typed in the chat, for you, history of name invalidation is in the US is huge. Right. And again, there's a historical connection to that and to racism again. Will the recording be shared? If so, where and when? The answer to that is yes. Chris is nodding. Thank you, Rebecca.
I don't have a question, but I'd really like to thank you for this training. It was really interesting and I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you so much, Ariel. I really appreciate that.
Of course.
And again, as I said to you at the beginning of this, these kinds of conversations are just that, right? I'm simply creating a space for us to learn from each other and to use some tools and examples. Because again, at some point today, I said, we're all human beings. And so we all know, right? We all know what these experiences can be like and why it's so important to be aware of it so that we can be equitable and trauma informed in our service delivery. And again, take care of ourselves as well. So thanks. And with that, I will hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Maite. And thank you everyone for joining us. I wasn't able to be here the whole time. The parts I really did enjoy, but thank you all for being here and attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solution Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on our next racial equity series. We do have some more series happening here in 2023. Note when you leave, a 3-question survey will pop up as the session ends. Please do provide your feedback. We review it every Wednesday, actually, so tomorrow. Be honest what you like, what you didn't like, what you need more of, because we actually do address and make our trainings based on your thoughts. So thank you very much for that. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.